All right, so now that we've got the preview and the news of the day done, I wanted to look at something here. And we're far enough into the season that, yes, this is pertinent. And while there will be people saying, remember St. Louis, outlier. St. Louis and Carolina, what they both did in the second half of last year was an outlier. So here's the question. Which of the teams on the board could have that kind of a run in them? What I did was I went through the standings from 21 through 31 in the NHL. What's interesting is we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 teams from the Atlantic Division. And if I had gone up to 20, there would be 6 teams in the Atlantic Division on the board. That's a brutal number right there when you consider that on the board I have 11 teams. And a number of them are from the same division. Starting with Montreal, who have 29 games played. They have a record of 12, 11, and 6. They have 30 points. They're one behind Buffalo for that third playoff spot in that division. They're not far behind Florida either. If we went up to 19th, Florida's on the board. So Boston, you've got the division, that's it. Boston wins their division, that's good. At least they should. Now, 1-6-3 is the record for Montreal over their last 10, so it's not like they're burning up the charts. And what's interesting is nobody in the bottom 11 teams in the league has a record above 500 over their last 10 games. None of them seem to be getting better and making that jump. Goals against per game for Montreal is 3.45, which is problematic because that's 28th. That has to come down. And for Montreal fans who are going to say, oh, our defense and our goaltending, I know, it seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? Penalty kill, 75% even. That's 29th in the NHL. Those numbers have to get better. They're not going to be, even if they pass Buffalo and they get into that last playoff spot in the Atlantic, you don't last very long with those kinds of numbers. It is interesting, though, that in the Atlantic, it is that dire situation where your third-place team is 20th overall in the NHL. So 22nd overall in the NHL is Toronto. We've heard a lot about Toronto over the last little while, but it's warranted. They're 30 games. They're 13, and 4 for 30 points. Also 1 point behind Buffalo. They sit behind Montreal because Montreal has a game in hand. They're 4-6 in their last 10. They are 4-3 under their new coach. And their goals against per game, 3.30, which is 25th in the National Hockey League. Again, I'm not saying anything Toronto fans don't already know. Their penalty kill's been miserable as well. It's 27th in the league at 75.5%. There's an asterisk because they were in the playoffs last year. And what's weird is that Toronto was expected to be a contender. They kept basically their team together. They added Barrie on the blue line. This team was supposed to be a contender. And you can see with Kyle Dubas when he's watching these games, this isn't turning out the way it's supposed to, and he's not happy about it. Their last game, he was quite visibly upset with the way that game turned out. And we'll see from here how things turn out for the Leafs. But this is a tough situation because if they don't turn it around and make the playoffs, remember, we're not talking about contending, but even make the playoffs, that could say something for Kyle Dubas and his position in the team. I have always felt that Dubas, good mind, good hockey guy, but whether he was old enough for this role, whether he was experienced enough for this role was the question I always had. And I'm not sure that we know yet whether or not he is going to end up staying for a long time as the Leafs general manager. It's the toughest job in hockey, is running the Maple Leafs. Tampa Bay is a huge surprise being here. They've only played 26 games. So yes, for Tampa fans, we're going to say we have games in hand on everybody. They do, but they're 13, 10, and 3 overall, which is 29 points. They are 2 points behind Buffalo, but they're 4, 5, and 1 in their last 10. They're not playing well. And it is a situation where we keep waiting. I keep waiting for Tampa to turn it around. They won a few in a row, and it looked like things are going to get there, and then no. That loss last night against Minnesota, that's disheartening. Their goals against per game is 3.31, which is 26th in the NHL. It's actually below Toronto and barely above Montreal. This is the problem. And again, these are 3 Atlantic Division teams all squashed in together. Yay! So Tampa Bay, as disappointing as this has been, they're only 2 points behind Buffalo. Yes, if they win 2 or 3 of these games that they have in hand, they end up being potentially as high as Florida, and they could be second in the division, and everything's great and fantastic. But the fact that they are right now overall in the NHL 23rd, that is alarming. This is a team that won 62 games last year. We didn't expect 62 wins this year, but we certainly didn't expect this. Speaking of unexpected, Nashville is very unexpected at 27 games, 12 wins, 10 regulation losses, and 5 overtime or shootout lost points. 29 points for them. They are 3 points behind Minnesota. Minnesota's in the playoffs right now because this is Bizarro land. They're 3-5-2 in their last 10. So again, if you look at the overall record, you can say, well, they'll be fine. But you look at their last 10, and things are kind of falling apart. Again, much like Tampa, much like Toronto, they were in the playoffs last year. Their goals against per game right now is at 3.19, which is 22nd overall. Nashville has prided themselves for many years on their defense and on their goaltending. And right now, there are question marks. There are absolutely question marks when it comes to their goaltending. Pekka Rinne, who looks like he could be turning it around, the reality is his overall numbers for this season have been lacking. And while Saros has been the better goaltender, his numbers haven't been fantastic either. So there are some concerns in Nashville, and I think the biggest concern I would have with Nashville is they just brought in Matt Duchene on a nice, expensive contract, and it may be difficult to fix this from here because of some of the contracts these players have. Anaheim, 28 games, 12 wins, 12 losses, 4 overtime or shootout loss points. 28 points overall. They're 4 points behind Minnesota. They're 3-4-3 in their last 10, so they're fading. Anaheim's absolutely fading. They're 2.68 goals for per game. That's 24th in the NHL. Keep in mind, they were scoring perfectly fine the first few weeks, so their numbers are actually worse over the last month and a half than what they show right now overall. Their power play is 29th in the league at 11.3%. You can't have an 11% power play and end up being a playoff team. That's just not going to end up happening. That being said, 4 points behind Minnesota. This is where people will say it's too early, don't worry about it. Now, a general manager doesn't really have anything to worry about. I think the panic point is when it's 8 points or more that you're out of the playoffs. That's where, as a general manager, you may be looking and saying, all right, we got to fix something, we got to change something, or in some cases, all right, it's time to get rid of the guys who have expiring contracts, make sure we get as many prospects and draft picks as possible, and move on from there. So Anaheim's not in that position right now. Chicago, 28 games played. They have a record of 11, 12, and 5, so 27 points. They're 5 behind Minnesota in that last playoff spot. They're 4-5-1 in their last 10. Their power play, 14.1%, 26th overall. The rest of their numbers aren't bad. And this is where it gets tough if you're Stan Bowman. You have some really good veterans, and you have some pretty good young kids too. And the overall mix of the team isn't bad. Depth is an issue. And like I said, their power play so far this year has been an issue, which is weird. Because when you can put Taves, DeBrincat, Kane, Strome, when you can put these guys on your power play and you've got Keith on the point, it's weird that the power play is that anemic overall. But it doesn't feel like things in Chicago are quite so bad that they necessarily have to tear everything apart or really make huge changes. So Chicago, of the teams I've gone through so far, Chicago's the one I look at and say, you know what, they could be a dark horse to turn it around pretty quickly. Nashville, I never underestimate Nashville and Tampa because of their games in hand. They project to be better, and yet the 4-5-1 record, I don't know. Columbus is tricky. 28 games played, 11-13-4 record, 26 points. They are 8 points behind Pittsburgh. So, this is where it's different. They are 3 points behind Tampa Bay. They are 5 points behind Buffalo. But, because they're in the Metro, they're 8 points out of the playoffs, where they have to catch Pittsburgh. And the odds of catching Pittsburgh are very, very slim, to be honest, right? So for them, and it's not just Pittsburgh either. There's the Rangers in between them and Pittsburgh. The Rangers are not on this board because the Rangers have had a pretty decent run. And so Columbus's odds are getting longer. Now, they're 5-5. They're the only team on this board that has a 500 record in their last 10 games. But 500 doesn't cut it. Doesn't cut it for these guys right now. They have to go on a run. They have to win 4 or 5 in a row, and then we can talk about it. But even at winning 4 or 5 in a row, which would take them up to 2 or 3 games above 500, you're still in this area. So for Columbus, it's a little shaky. Their goals for per game, 2.5. They're 29th overall, so the expectation that they would have trouble scoring has proven to be true. And then their goals against is 26th at 3.31 against per game. So if your goals for and goals against are in the bottom quarter of the league, you have a very slim chance of making the playoffs. That's math. And for Columbus, it's exactly where they were expected to be, where they're last in the division. It's a very, very competitive division. Like I said, if they were in the Atlantic, they'd only be 5 points back. But we are already at a stage where Jarmo Kekalainen could look at this franchise and say, all right, where are we at? We're 8 points back of Pittsburgh. It's highly unlikely we're going to catch Pittsburgh. It's highly unlikely we're going to get anywhere near the Islanders, Carolina, Washington. So I might as well look at my future and say, all right, who do we have that we can move out? So that's where it's going to get interesting. Now, Ottawa is underneath them. 29 games, 12, 16, and 11 record, 25 points. But they're only 6 points out of the playoffs, again, because they're in the Atlantic. They're 6 points behind Buffalo. And the Senators overachieved during that winning streak, but outside of that winning streak, they've had a miserable run. And what hurts them is that 9.9% power play, which is easily worst in the league. And so that's where Ottawa gets hurt. And what hurts them too is, so when you're playing against a team that has a miserable power play like that, you're more likely to hook, hold, slash. You're more likely to do that on a play where you may allow a goal because you're thinking, all right, I would rather take a slashing penalty here and make sure he doesn't score than take that risk because their power play is awful, and we know their power play is awful. So I'll sit in the box for a couple of minutes, but we have a 90.1% chance of killing that off, and if he gets that shot away, he has a 30% chance of that going in from that angle. So I'll take those odds. So that's where a really poor power play starts to affect a team. Because, yeah, teams will say, all right, well, we'll take the penalty rather than risk them being able to get that shot away. And for Ottawa, they don't have that prime player yet that can run a power play. Shabbat's going to be there. Brady Tkachuk may eventually be there. I do think on some nights that Tkachuk's being asked to do too much too soon. And that trading off everybody last year, as Ottawa did because they didn't want to pay anybody, I think they pay for that some nights now in terms of Tkachuk being front and center just a little bit too often. But maybe that'll benefit him later. LA Kings, 29 games, 11, 16, and 2 record, 24 points. They're 8 points back in Minnesota. So again, you're at that point now where you're looking and going, all right, well, we're 4-5-1 in our last 10. We're not gaining ground. We have some good games here and there. We play pretty well at home. But power play 11.2%, which is 30th. Penalty kills 28th at 75.3%. Those special teams numbers don't work. So unless you have a vision for how you're going to turn the special teams around, which is kind of why they brought in Kovalchuk, not this past summer, but the summer before, the idea being he would get their power play up there, right? You kind of have to look at LA right now and say, okay, we may have to make some moves here. This is where Jonathan Quick's name is going to start coming up. And I would think as we get closer to the deadline, those talks should pick up. Cal Peterson would have to clear waivers next fall. He's not clearing waivers. Peterson, last year when he came up, looked ready. So they have Peterson, they have Campbell. Now, unless they decide to move Jack Campbell, which is possible, and it's possible because it's easier to move Campbell. Campbell doesn't have a horrible cap hit. He signed beyond this year. You might be able to get something good for Campbell if you think Peterson's going to be ready next year to be the backup. Or even ready after the trade deadline to be the backup. And there might be more teams interested in Campbell than in Quick. So that's where things get really interesting for me with the Kings. But playoffs just aren't, to me, it's just not in the cards for them. The New Jersey Devils definitely not making the playoffs. 27 games, 9, 14, and 4, 22 points. They are 12 points back of Pittsburgh. And to give you an example of how difficult it is to make that up, the St. Louis Blues, who as bad as they were, I don't think they ever got further than 7 points out of the playoffs. I don't think they ever got beyond 7. That's why Armstrong didn't tear it down. Because again, until you get beyond 8, or especially when you get into double digits, you don't really need to tear it around or tear it down because they can turn it around. And New Jersey, I don't see the turnaround coming. Right now, I mean, you've got to look at it this way. They would have to go on a run of, 7 in a row in order to get back into the hunt. And even then, the odds of them catching Pittsburgh, they're not great. And this is a Pittsburgh roster without anybody. They're 4-6 in their last 10. They're 28th in goals for per game. They are 30th in goals against per game. And I need to put the full numbers up there. When you're 28th in one and 30th in the other, your goal differential is terrible. And for New Jersey, this has been a disaster. This is why when they picked up PK Subban in the offseason, there was a risk to it. You're picking up that $9 million cap hit. Nashville takes that $9 billion cap hit, gives that to Duchesne. It's interesting that both Nashville and New Jersey are on this board because both teams were expected to be better this year. Nashville had added that center that was supposed to increase their scoring, and they were going to be great down the middle. It's ended up with Turris being a healthy scratch, and we don't know what's going on with him, and his contract makes him virtually untradeable. And meanwhile, New Jersey, they've got Subban, who has just not produced at all. He was supposed to be that point-producing, goal-producing defenseman, and it just has not happened. And so what happens when your offensive defenseman isn't producing is that all of a sudden all the defensive deficiencies show up. The one thing that was always said with PK Subban in Montreal was he made fantastic plays, he was on the ice a lot, but he would have a glaring error that would show up every game or two. That was usually something you could overlook because his offense was so great. And it was a high-risk game that he played. Well, when he's playing that high-risk game and he's not getting the points, that's when he's going to take a lot of the blame. So, PK, $9 million. I don't feel bad for the guy at $9 million, but I do wonder how things go from here. Like, what does New Jersey do if he continues to produce at such a low rate? What do you do with him in the offseason? You can't trade him. And is a buyout even something they could look at? I don't think so. I don't think it's a contract that's easy to buy out or worth that either. So some interesting storylines with New Jersey, and keeping Corey Schneider throughout the summer seems to have cost them as well. 0-4-1 record for Schneider. If you have a goaltender in there instead of Schneider, who may have won some of those games, they would end up and about here, and who knows, maybe they would still be in the hunt, and we'd be having a whole different discussion. Still not a playoff team, but at least in the hunt. And, of course, we ended off with Detroit. Detroit is well aware they're not making the playoffs. 30 games, 7-20-3. 7 wins in 30 games. These guys will be lucky to win, 20 at best? 14 points out of the playoffs with 17 points overall. They are 14 points behind Buffalo. It's a miserable run for Detroit. They're 0-8-2 in their last 10, so it's just nosedive for them. And I don't foresee anything happening with Detroit other than selling off assets. Who wants our assets? Everything must go. You can just throw Yzerman into the middle of like a mattress warehouse and just put different Detroit Red Wing players' names on each mattress, and you can say how much percentage off there is, and then we'll take your prospects, we'll take your draft picks. Do you have both? Come on in and talk to Crazy Stevie Y at the Detroit warehouse. 63 goals for, 118 goals against. That's the worst in the league in both categories. They score the least, they allow the most, and they're at the bottom of the board. So when we look at this, a few of these teams are going to be making the playoffs. I can't see any scenario Tampa misses the playoffs, and I can't foresee Nashville missing the playoffs either. I want to say I can't foresee Toronto missing the playoffs. I do. I really do, because I like their young players. I like what they've been doing. I've been on board with what's going on with Toronto. I just look at where the conferences are right now. I look at the standings and I think, well, if Tampa gets in, I guess Florida could drop out and allow Toronto in, but Montreal's right there too. I don't know. Could Toronto actually miss the playoffs? And I think that is possible. That is actually possible. So that's the question I asked to you guys. Which of the teams that's on the board right now that has a poor record over their last 10 games? We're not looking at anybody on this board right now that's 8-2 in their last 10 and they're cruising up. All of these teams have been kind of middle of the pack, mediocre during any given streak during this season. Which of these teams turns it around? Does Anaheim have it in them to turn it around? Does Chicago make that run? And let me know what you guys think in the comments section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. I thought this would be a fun thing to look at now because we are at that stage where almost every team in the league has played enough games that we can say, all right, we know what they are, we know where they're at, and what we're going to get. I think Tampa is still figuring themselves out. They have a goal differential of +9 overall, but I don't know. 6 of those are that 9-3 win over the Rangers, so I really don't know with Tampa what to expect. That 5-4 loss with Minnesota last night just threw everything out of whack for me. But let me know your thoughts as always in the comment section. I will talk to you again soon.